So just a reminder to folks who are registered, check to make sure I've got the attendance and makeups and all those kinds of cool things right online. And also, remember that a reflection is due ideally by the end of March, okay? Which just is, your summary and thoughts about all the wonderful things we've had an opportunity to learn together from our speakers this semester. If you have any questions, anything, don't understand anything, whatever, think I got something wrong, I did my very best to write down people's names, but when they talked, I might not have gotten it all right. Please, oh please, let me know. And my email is francisl@law.utah.edu, and as you all know, I respond really. If I don't respond, it means somehow I hit the delete button. I didn't mean to. That does every so often happen. So we are absolutely delighted today to welcome the last, but by far not the least of our distinguished visitors from other law schools. This is Professor Nicholson Price, who's at the University of Michigan Law School. There are a lot of us folks.
Where's Amos?
Yeah, my PhD's from Michigan, so there are a bunch of us who like Michigan. He is got his JD and his PhD in biology from Columbia. No other woo-hoos? He was also a fellow. You may be familiar with the Petrie-Flom Center at Harvard that has fellowships, somewhat like the fellowships we have here. We think our fellowships are, well, ours are for law students. Your Petrie-Flom was a research fellowship after you.
Plus it's defunct, so yours is definitely better.
So ours exists. That's a little commercial. If you are a rising 3L, there's still time to apply for one of our fellowships for next year. So they exist. Or a rising 2L, if you happen to be visiting. But Professor Price is going to speak to us on the topic of drug approvals in a learning healthcare system. So thank you very much.
Hi, thanks so much for having me here. I have not been to Salt Lake City before, and it is astonishingly beautiful, and this place is awesome, and I'm super jealous of all of you, although still, go blue. But it's great to be here, so thanks all for coming. I'm glad to see that here, like everywhere else I've ever been, very few people sit in the front row, except when all of the seats in the back row are occupied, so I appreciate that. So I want to talk about drug approval in a learning health system, and I'll tell you obviously what that means. So basically I'm going to talk in 4 sections. So first, I want to talk about the process of drug approval in general and what the kind of big tug of war is in the timing of drug approval. I'll talk about how a learning health system can potentially, or at least the idea of a learning health system, can offer us some tools to help think about solving that tension or relieving that tension. I'll talk about how the law might screw that up, and how we might think about how the law creates impediments to this process, in particular the law of informed consent and the law of privacy. I'll then broaden it out a little bit from just drug approval to other sorts of big data and medicine issues in the context of those in a learning health system. And then I'll finish up with a few solutions, although I think the solutions are somewhat unsatisfactory. And then hopefully we'll have lots of robust discussion and see how that goes. So basically for the 80 years or so that the FDA has been regulating drugs, it makes everybody mad pretty much all of the time. It turns out that no matter when, you can think about the process of approving a drug as kind of pulling a trigger. There's a binary state. The drug is approved or it's not approved. It's a bright line. And the question is, how much information do you need to approve a drug. When along the timeline of constantly developing information about a drug, you say, okay, we know enough, now we're going to approve it and let it be used in patients. If you do it too late, then patients that can't get access to a drug are incredibly upset because they think that you're denying, or they think that FDA is denying them life-saving medications. If you've seen Dallas Buyers Club, you have seen this dynamic in action. Patients want drugs, and when FDA won't approve them because it says we don't have enough information, patients get very, very upset. On the other hand, if you approve drugs too early in the process, when we don't know enough about the drugs, we don't know when they're safe, we don't know for whom they work, we don't know when they work, then we have a challenge that patients are taking drugs that might not help them at all, or might help them but might hurt them more, and might work for some people but not others, and we don't know when or why. So the question is, when do you approve drugs? And at the heart of why this is a problem, why there's a problematic tension, is the fact that getting information about drugs is really hard. The main way that we get information about when drugs work and why they work is through the process of random control trials. And these are really, really expensive ways to gather information, right? You take lots of people, you give some of them the drug, you give other ones not the drug, you do that randomly, you wait a while, you see who gets better, who doesn't get better, who has side effects, how quickly the drug works, all of those sorts of things. But these suffer from a number of problems. They are they're slow in that if you're looking to develop information quickly, randomized controlled trials take months or possibly a couple of years to do, so they're a slow way to generate information. Even though they're slow, they're relatively short compared to the timelines you're often looking at, right? Because if you're wondering about what is it like to take a drug for 5 years, or 10 years, or 15 years, no one's going to run a clinical trial that long. And so we're left not knowing what happens when you actually take the drug for these long period of times, and what long-term effects we might see, whether good or bad. And they're also small, right? Clinical trials can be 10 or hundreds or thousands of people, but once you actually give drugs to populations, often you're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of people. And so when you worry about things like rare side effects or subpopulation effects, or for whom it works and for whom it doesn't, clinical trials are at best a highly imperfect tool to try to get that sort of information. And so what we're left with is a set of information that's quite simple and quite expensive to generate. And that's what we have to make these determinations about whether or not you should approve a drug. So people have suggested a bunch of ways to try to fix this, and most of them revolve around, in some form, blurring the line of approval, which is to say, we'll approve it earlier, or even if we don't approve it earlier, we'll give people access to the drug earlier, some people access to the drug earlier, and then on the back end, we'll try to keep gathering information about the drug. We'll monitor how it works in real life, and maybe we'll run some phase 4 clinical trials and have companies keep doing clinical trials even after the drug's approved. We'll keep gathering information and try to diffuse this tension. The problem with that is it's really hard to actually do. Running clinical trials is expensive. And once a drug is approved, the drug sponsor really has very little incentive to actually spend that money and run those clinical trials. FDA can require it. They can say as a condition of approval, well, you have to commit to running phase 4 clinical trials. But even though they do that a lot, it turns out companies very rarely actually fulfill these requirements. Unclear why FDA doesn't kind of bring the hammer down, but there's a lot of outcry if you actually withdraw a drug from the market. And so a large fraction of clinical trial mandates after approval go unfulfilled. In addition, the incentives are tough for patients, right? Why, once a drug is approved, why would you say, please give me a 50% chance of getting this drug that might cure me, or a 50% chance of getting a placebo or some older drug, or just go to your doctor and definitely get the drug? Why would you choose to be in a clinical trial once you can already access the drug? Now that's bad for us. We would like to have that information, but it's really hard to generate it. So how do we think about solving this problem? How do we fix this information issue? Well, there's a parallel development going on in the health system more generally, which is the idea of a learning health system. And to talk about that, I'll take a brief step back and talk about how information is generated in health more generally. And it's not that different, which is to say, if we're talking about health interventions, whether particular surgeries work or whether drugs work or whether whatever sort of health thing works, the way we typically generate that information is, again, through random controlled trials, do it through RCTs. We generate information, and then once we have the information, we step over into the totally separate world of care and apply it. But once we're in the world of actual care, we don't tend to collect information about how well these things work. This is the traditional model. Things are changing now, which is part of the point. We don't tend to collect information about how well things work. We don't tend to systematize that. We don't tend to generalize that. We don't tend to use that information. It's just over here in research land, we figure out stuff about healthcare. And then over here in clinical care land, we apply that knowledge. And these two are very separate worlds. There are some exceptions. Pediatric oncology is actually a pretty interesting exception. But for the majority of cases, the worlds of clinical care and research, or clinical research, are very, very separate. So you can see some similarities here. We have expensive generation of information, and then the question of what do we actually do with that information and the difficulty in generating information later on. There are some differences here in one context, the drug context, obviously. We have the FDA and a particular product and approval, and for health in general, we have all sorts of interventions and no kind of gatekeeper standing between those two worlds. So the idea of a learning health system tries to challenge this view. It tries to challenge this bright separation between clinical research and clinical care. It is pretty simple, but actually pretty radical, at least in the medical world, which is to say, throughout the context of clinical care, throughout the course of clinical care, we should continuously be generating and collecting data about how things are actually working. How are patients treated? What happens to those patients? Do they actually get better? When you give somebody drugs and they go home and you don't see them again until next time, it's a really useful thing to know whether they got better in the interim or it took them a long time and they never really got better and you're just seeing them again for the same thing later. Collecting that kind of data is important. And then once we have those data, the idea in a learning health system is that we continually analyze those data. We continually learn from them. And then we take that information, that knowledge, and plug it back into the course of care so that ideally we are continually learning and improving care. So the question is, how might we think about this idea of a learning health system and use it to help improve the process of drug approval? How might FDA use the concept of learning health system to help fix this problem of post-approval information gathering and use? I think about two different ways that this might happen. One of them is pretty straightforward, which is observational, which is to say, well, if we want to know how a drug is working in the market, then let's just watch and let's see. And if companies don't want to do those trials for the reasons that we talked about earlier, which is to say they don't have the incentives to run them, and patients don't have the incentives to participate, and so we don't have trials, well, instead we can just take lots of observational data about what happens to patients and use those and then mine them to see, well, is this drug working better, or is this drug working worse, and for whom is this drug working? And we can take those observational data, and instead of companies having to run clinical trials or FDA trying to figure out some other way to get the data, we can just pull them out of the health system, which is theoretically at least already collecting this. This is relatively more straightforward. The challenge with that, of course, is that observational data make it tough to determine causation. So you can also think about using a learning health system to do something which I think is incredibly cool, which is interventional studies in a learning health system. So imagine a situation where you have a patient that goes into the hospital with chronic migraines. First-time patient with chronic migraines. And it turns out there are two drugs on the market. We'll call them no-no-pain and decapitol. And it's totally unclear which drug works better for which patients. Sometimes one drug works, sometimes the other drug works. Really unclear which is going to work and when it's going to work and what the characteristics are. This, by the way, is the case for lots of drugs. right? Lots of cancer drugs, migraine drugs, lots of pain drugs. They work for some people, not others. We really don't know why or how, and we just kind of try our way through them to see what works. So we might say, instead of randomly trying our way through these drugs based on what the doctor happens to have in her sample drawer, or what drug company rep visited last, or what the last patient responded to, or something like that. Instead, when the doctor inputs into the electronic health record, into the EHR, diagnosis of chronic migraine, immediately the system puts the person into a clinical trial. A no-friction clinical trial, and just straight off, rather than running any of the other processes we associate with the clinical trial, just responds, okay, chronic migraine, this patient should take no-pain. Or if it were a different patient, this patient should take Decapitol, and just randomizing them right at the point of entry, and essentially running a clinical trial under the process of care and replacing the randomness or quasi-randomness or pseudo-randomness of a doctor's assignment of different treatment outcomes with an actual randomization that's run entirely within the electronic health system. Now, question, yes?
But when you're doing that, especially if it's in an actual clinical setting rather than just a clinical trial setting, wouldn't the results be skewed because you're taking into consideration other medical factors?
So, if you posit that we have enough information, about the drug to say, this is a situation where we think no-pain will work better because, say, the patient has an additional complication of kidney problems, and no-pain is known to have a better issue with people with kidney problems, then yes, we would expect it to be biased and you would kick somebody out of this. If, on the other hand, you're just saying some patients are going to have certain issues, other patients are going to have other issues, the whole point of doing a randomized controlled trial is if you get big numbers and you're randomly assigning people to one arm or the other, you should expect those sorts of imbalances to cancel out overall. Yes, George?
So, what randomized
Would you
control
rather
trial? Well, can we interrupt you?
Sure, go for it. Evidently.
Randomized control trial is usually a placebo, not two drugs that are, and for this to work, there have to be two drugs that are basically at the same stage of investigation for the same indication. Which, how common is that?
Yeah, so you don't have to have two drugs that are at the same stage of, well, when you say the same stage of investigation, that I think is the key in your question. Because if you're asking, are there two, say, migraine drugs or two cancer drugs that are both at stage 2 clinical trials or stage 3 clinical trials, I'll agree, that's unlikely. If, on the other hand, what you're saying is we're talking about the world of post-approval drugs, then we've got lots of drugs that are in phase 4 clinical trials, although they're not actually being run, which is to say we talk about tons of drugs that are all approved and available. One other fillip I just want to add to this, which is really neat possibility when you have this sort of automated randomization and you're running these trials, you can actually run them adaptively, which is to say, as you generate data, you can use those to weigh the randomization. So say you have a randomized clinical trial and your prior is no-pain and Decapitol work exactly the same amount. We have no intuition that one of them is better than the other. As you run through the trial, you find out that actually Decapitol helps about 70% of patients and no-pain helps about 30% of patients. You can skew the randomization such that in 7 cases, when a new patient enters, in 7 cases out of 10, they'll get Decapitol, and in 3 cases out of 10, they'll get no-pain. You can keep the randomization, you can keep demonstrating causation, but the standard of care that you get from that is actually better than you would have gotten before, and better than you would get in a standard clinical trial. So we can have a clinical trial set up that's actually improving the care patients get more than either old clinical trial or regular care. Yes?
So in order to make this kind of randomization effective, how would you address the difficulty of price differentials between the drugs? Would you have to control the price of the drugs as well?
Two different questions show up there, right? On the one hand, so if you're asking if there's a price differential between, two issues show up. One issue is if there's a price differential, we might have variable compliance between patients, right? So some patients might actually take the drug if it's got a low copay, or not, and not take the drug if it has a high copay. In which case, yeah, if you want this, if you want this to work, you would have to say that within the context of that, we're going to need to equalize the costs of them, which might not always be the case. If we're talking about drugs within a standardized formulary, you know, as long as they're both brand or both generic, frequently they'll be within the same tier. But you're quite right that if we have an instance where we're comparing an older generic to a newer brand name, and we want to collect those data, that's not going to be as seamless as a situation where they automatically start low price. So I'm going to keep going, and then I will totally take lots more questions. I promise. If you have questions, please note them, or maybe more questions will pop up, and we'll see. But I'm going to keep going for a little bit. So we can at least think of interesting ways that we can use the learning health system to try to increase the knowledge that we have about drugs. The challenge for this is that even if I've sold you that this is a cool and interesting set of possibilities, the law really doesn't like what this is doing. And in particular, the law of informed consent and the law of privacy, at least as embodied in HIPAA, is really not a fan of blurring the worlds of clinical care and clinical research. And both of those regimes, in fact, rely on drawing sharp, bright lines between clinical research and clinical care. So HIPAA, privacy rule, just a sense, are you basically familiar with HIPAA or basically unfamiliar with HIPAA? Who thinks like, yeah, I'm good with HIPAA, I can tell you what a covered entity is, I know what PHI is. All right, cool.
It's going to vary. Yeah.
So it's going to vary. So the essential rule in HIPAA is that covered entities, which are, you know, health insurance plans and hospitals and doctors and healthcare providers and folks like that, can't use or disclose protected health information, which is essentially individually identifiable health information, unless they have an authorization or some sort of exemption. Not allowed to, there's a blanket, you can't do it unless you can. Authorizations, it turns out, are a pain. There are lots of procedural hurdles to go through to get authorizations from patients to use information. In particular, if you're trying to do this sort of observational after-the-fact implementation, then it's quite hard to get authorizations for retrospective analysis. And there are exemptions, and exemptions are the way that we tend to use data. And interestingly enough, there is an exemption for healthcare operations and even for quality improvement. So we could say, hey, maybe this exemption for quality improvement is going to let us use these data to figure out what's going on, because surely there could be nothing that's going to improve quality more than figuring out whether or not this drug actually works for these patients. But, in fact, no, HIPAA explicitly says quality improvement and healthcare operations does not include research, which is to say, you can try to improve quality in a relatively haphazard process, but once you are doing something that is defined as trying to generate generalizable knowledge, that's how they define research, generalizable knowledge, then it's no longer within that exemption, and you can no longer do it under HIPAA. So as long as you do things sloppily, you're fine. If you're doing things in the context of care, and yes, this looks a little better, and yes, this looks a little worse, that's fine. Once you try to say, let's get serious about this, let's figure out what works, let's run a serious retrospective analysis, or let's run this ongoing interventional trial, that's when HIPAA steps in and says, no, you're now in the world of clinical research. You're not in the world of just doing care anymore, and the gates slam down and everything gets harder. There's a very bright line between these two worlds. Informed consent, we see much the same pattern, which is to say, so just out of curiosity, how many of you, I probably should, all right, my guess is that some number of you have participated in some sort of research study in the past. Maybe you did it as an intro psych class or something like that. And if you notice, or if God forbid any of you have run a study like this, the informed consent process is rather intense. And institutional review boards create long or demand very long forms that say, here are all the things you have to do in informed consent. You have to tell everybody about this. And here are the 4 pages of things you have to read and sign and all of these sorts of things. There's a big set of rules to ensure that we get great informed consent for research participants. On the other hand, the informed consent that you do when you're in the context of clinical care is usually more along the lines of, I'm going to give you this drug. And so then you say, okay. And Did you miss it? In there was informed consent. So we're not particularly persnickety about informed consent in the context of medical care. If you've done medical malpractice law and tort, you know that bringing an informed consent action is almost guaranteed to fail, and this is something where we don't stress out about it, right? I'm not going to say that there's quite as sharp a line in terms of here is the rule, but over here in research land, we stress out about informed consent a lot. And over here in clinical care land, we don't stress out about informed consent very much at all. We do a little bit, but not in the same sort of way. So both of these are areas where we draw a really sharp line between care and not care. I'll take a, no, I'm gonna leave that aside. We'll see if it comes up in the Q&A. So, what this ends up doing is saying we are really interested and we're especially protective of people in the context of care, or in the context of research. But when we come over to the context of care, we're not so worried about it, even though oddly enough, the quality of care is decreased by the fact that we can't actually access all these data and use them to improve care. So, taking a step one further back, does this show up in other contexts? And of course the answer is yes. This is not just an issue that shows up in the context of drug approval. It shows up throughout the idea of a learning healthcare system, and in fact throughout the idea of big data and medical learning in general. So we can think about using these sorts of data, the sort of data that are generated in the context of regular care, whether just through observation or potentially through interventional trials, to do things like precision medicine in general or precision oncology in particular, where we try to figure out really how do we target particular treatments to particular patients using the full set of information that we can gather and say this is really going to work for you or this is really not. It shows up in the development of artificial intelligence in medicine and running algorithms to say, here's what might happen to you. Here is a more specific prognosis for your particular illness. Here's a better shot at diagnosis, the kind of things where we can say now a Google image search for tumors on an X-ray. All of these applications require tremendous amounts of medical data. And all of these applications similarly run into the sharp line between the process of research and the process of clinical care. And to the extent that we blur those two in the context of a learning health system, the law is going to continue to make that blurring harder to do. So I'll finish by just offering a couple of thoughts as to what we might think of as at least mechanistic suggestions for improvement, although, as I'll note, they have some challenges. So, for HIPAA, the way to change the law would be pretty simple. Whether or not it's a good idea is a tougher argument. I tend to think that it is, but a lot of people shout vociferously in the opposite direction. So as part of the 21st Century Cares Act, which passed in December, not this past December, December 2016, an early draft of it had an additional exemption to HIPAA, which just said research is now considered part of healthcare operations. And therefore, we're going to neatly run our thumb down that bright line and erase it and say, we're not worried about this, and if you can do something in the context of quality improvement, and you can do it in a relatively haphazard fashion, you can also do it in a more rigorous fashion to generate generalizable knowledge. There was a great hue and cry from patient privacy advocates who said this is terrible, they'll be using our data for lots of bad purposes, and this provision dropped out of the law. But if we wanted to say that HIPAA was really a big concern here, it would be pretty straightforward to remove that concern in the context of research by just writing in that exemption. Informed consent's a little trickier. I think from a legal standpoint, you could imagine saying, we are going to let informed consent for clinical care do double duty, which is to say, when you give your informed consent for clinical care, which as we talked about is often pretty straightforward and often implied by the relationship that you have with your doctor or your hospital or your health system, we'll assume that informed consent does double duty, also for the purpose of, say, non-invasive ongoing medical research in the context of a learning health system. So that sort of informed consent, or that sort of consent, also will apply to the later use of your data for observational studies, or even to randomization, as long as we're within the standard of care, which is to say, if you're going to get either no pain or decapitol already, we don't know which one's going to work. When you come in to be treated, we will treat that consent as also applying to that sort of randomization. Now, some health systems actually do something like this already. Really interesting, Vanderbilt Hospital is itself a learning health system, and they take patient data in the course of clinical care and use that for not just quality improvement studies, but generalizable research to try to figure out kind of how they improve care. And their entry form says, we are a learning hospital, we are going to gather your data, we are going to use them for this type of activity. And I asked the GC of the hospital, what's your opt-out? Can patients opt out of this? And he said, sure, they can go to a different hospital. Which is interesting, of course, because if what you want is an unbiased sample, then opting out is challenging. And so you say, no, if you're here, you're participating in the system where you're going to get an accurate picture of the patients that we have in the system. Anyway, so HIPAA, right, and a research exemption, potentially. Informed consent, we could say informed consent to clinical care does double duty for at least non-crazy research, recognizing all of the law that's buried in non-crazy right there. Challenge to this, of course, is the ethical obligation of physicians and the legal obligations imposed by the legal system are not necessarily the same. So you could imagine that physicians still say, even though you've said this is legally okay, I'm going to view my ethical obligations as more stringent, and therefore I won't willingly participate in this type of study. But at least we would get the law out of that other bright line situation. Overall, I think the key balance is looking at how much we protect the individual who's looking at going into a research trial or in some sort of generate knowledge setting, and balancing that interest about the fact that when they're getting care that is informed by all the information that we have or don't have. We seem to have no problem saying, here's a very high bar for privacy and for informed consent to participate in research, but we don't have anywhere near the same sort of high bar to say you're going to be receiving care that is substandard because we don't know what we're doing. Which in many cases is exactly true, right? Lots and lots of medical care is essentially based on informed guesses and relatively small sets of available data. We do the best we can, but the best we can right now is fairly sloppy. And so the question is, how do we do it better? And with that, I will stop and take your questions, including questions that you may have held over from earlier in the talk. Yes.
So, who administers the system, and are there ways to game the system by drug manufacturers, as you say it?
When you say who administers the system, what do you mean by the system?
You mentioned a public health record system and it giving recommendations for drugs to patients.
Oh, so who kind of runs the electronic health record system?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so there's not kind of one general one. Typically, these are going to be, a hospital will have its own EHR system. Really interesting issues, by the way, in that the EHR systems that are used by different hospitals are often deliberately incompatible because the people that make them don't want them to share information with each other. Anyway, so hospitals or doctors' offices get sold these IT systems that are going to record health data. And they're administered by the hospitals or the doctor's office or by somebody remotely. Is there a way that pharmaceutical companies will game them? Yes. Absolutely, definitely. I say that only because I have not yet encountered any situation related to the drug industry in any way, shape, or form that the pharmaceutical companies have not been able to figure out how to game.
Okay.
There is an essentially unlimited amount of money in gaming the legal system around pharmaceuticals. If any of you are practicing in the drug industry, you will get to practice on lots of cutting-edge legal issues because there's so much money. Anyway, I don't know exactly how you game it. There are interesting incentives, right? In that, drug companies, we would think drug companies are the best placed to gather information about their own products, because they're their own products. But the incentives are all wrong, right? Essentially, the only kind of information that a drug company wants to gather about its product is this product works better than somebody else's product. That's great. Like, that's awesome. Or it's so much safer than we thought. That's awesome information, but you can't know beforehand whether or not that's going to be the case. If, on the other hand, you happen to discover product safety problems, or that your drug is actually worse than somebody else, or that your drug's the same as somebody else, but their drug's cheaper, like, these are all the kinds of information you don't want to gather. So the incentives for drug companies to gather the information are pretty lousy, which is why I think it's a useful idea to try to think about a different way to gather information that's not reliant on drug companies, right? So right now, almost all the information we get about drugs is from drug companies and is from the time before approval. And the information we get after approval, to the extent that it happens, also a lot of it is often run by drug companies, kind of fulfilling those post-approval study commitments. But all of those forms of information gathering have pretty significant conflicts in terms of what the companies actually want out there.
Hey, thanks. That was great. So, yeah, that's it. No, that's it. I really like this. I've thought a lot about what's the proper distinction between clinical medicine and research. And if you are a clinical researcher, you're wearing two hats, but that your patient doesn't always see that you're wearing two hats. You're just their doctor. There are a handful of cases where there have been questions about researcher liability in the context of clinical research. Not that many, though. And when I was looking at them, I was trying to figure out how you figure out what the standard of care is when it's a physician researcher and patient is somehow injured by the N of 1 research or N of small number research. If you scale that up to a big learning system, and the idea is to be learning better practices from the data that's coming back, I think that's fantastic. I can see a lot of applications in precision medicine, and you should have gone up to Huntsman because they were trying to do that and they just didn't quite, the promise was not quite fulfilled. But I'm wondering if in that distinction between the physician and physician researcher, and the one that the law, tort law especially, has really tried to toe that line of, we think these are very different things because the special relationship that exists between a physician and patient, it doesn't exist between a researcher subject. But again, if it is the physician researcher, then that special relationship does exist. And this special relationship imposes all of these tort obligations that aren't there in the research context. Not just medical malpractice, but the duty to warn and a lot of other things that don't exist in research that exist in just through tort law, not through common rule and the research regulations. But I guess, so all of that header to get to the question of, do you think there could be a way to insulate researchers from negligence-y, medical malpractice-y type liability for when, or how would you think through what the standard of care ought to be or how it's determined when the whole idea is that we don't really have a standard of care and that's why we're doing this. But you could have subgroups that might pull off and say, well, I think that this research was actually the algorithm that was used, or do you see what I'm getting at? How would you define what the standard of care is in this context? Or would you have something like, if you followed the evidence-based practices or the algorithm, then you're insulated from liability as a researcher?
So, I think I'm not quite following, and here's why. It seems to me that if we're talking about research that occurs principally in the context of care, the duties of the researcher will, I can't think of situations where you have a duty as a researcher that are greater than the duty that you have as a care provider.
In the tort
right,
context.
They're usually less. Yeah. So if what we're talking about is research that happens in the context of care, it strikes me that the research duties will always be a subset of duties that are always there by virtue of the fact that the patient's receiving care.
I guess what I'm getting at is it becomes more systematized, and they're not N of 1 studies, but it's like assumed that if you're at Vanderbilt, you're enrolled, that the ability to distinguish between them falls apart, and all of that case law that rests on the distinction is just not so robust, because the researchers had far fewer obligations, but that was in a world where they were very different things, and now they're increasingly
Yeah.
not different things.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because I think this is also following a sort of parallel development in the law of medical malpractice, which is the increasing tilt towards direct corporate liability of kind of health systems and hospitals in general. So I think where you might see this showing up is, what if, say, I'm trying to apply researcher liability towards somebody who's programming the EHR or analyzing data that are not actually involved in the process of care.
Yeah.
Right, and that's where you might see, here's somebody that's not actually talking to the patient, not actually dealing
lab
with them
worker,
directly.
yeah.
So we don't see that kind of direct special relationship, but they're still involved in research. Is there some kind of tort relationship? If we're moving towards a system where we tend to see more direct corporate liability, and we say, okay, the health system is the one that's actually responsible for managing your care, which some jurisdictions are, Pennsylvania and other places. I should remember more of them, and I don't. Anyway, then I think this issue would again drop out, which is to say, if the system is the one providing you care and the system is the one generally doing the research, then we'd still see that overlap where the care provision obligations are going to subsume the research provision obligations. But you're right, there might be a transition time, I think, where we'd see people who are involved.
It's probably a temporary problem. It's just,
Yeah,
I think it's.
there's possible that there's a temporary problem there where people are involved in research who aren't involved in care, and to the extent that this research gets more systematized, they might be more vulnerable under tort standards. And the question is how to set that right. I'm not
Or that
yet
there's,
sure that it exists, and I'm not yet sure that if it does exist, it's not just temporary, but.
I don't want to monopolize your time. Oh, we can talk later. I
Yeah,
have some more.
Stephanie and then George.
Okay, so I think this is a really cool idea and with a lot of promise, and I just have a lot of kind of random thoughts and considerations that I'll just throw at you, and you
Oh, all right.
can respond however you want. But one of them has to do with like who is going to be responsible for the research design and the data analysis, that kind of thing. Another has to do with blinding. So, most clinical trials there's blinding, and we would not have that here. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. And then I have a few kind of questions or issues about the randomization. And how they would deal with certain things. So one is drug advertising, right? So what if someone comes in and says, I saw an ad for Viagra and I want Viagra. Another is generic substitution laws, right? So, in certain states, they're for cost reasons, you're required to give the generic instead of the branded drug. And then another issue with the randomization is the ethical issue. So you kind of answered this in a different context, but I'm thinking of a situation where what if the data starts coming in and it shows that, not that, this one is better in 70% of the cases, but this one is really good for people who exhibit X characteristics, right? And doesn't work for people who exhibit Y characteristics. Then all of a sudden, there are ethical issues with kind of randomly assigning the drugs when you have this new information about who it's going to work on and who it's not going to work on. So those are all just kind of thoughts that I had, and I'd be happy to hear whatever thoughts that you had in reply.
Yeah, those are a bunch of thoughts, but great thoughts. So as to who designs these sorts of trials, I think you can imagine the sort of people that you would expect,
People who wear bow ties.
Yes, definitely people who wear bow ties. They design the best trials. I think you could act. I was starting out by saying the sort of people that would design trials in general, but I think that's wrong. Which is to say, I think it's a much broader set than that. I think part of the really interesting bit about a learning health system is it reduces the barriers to trying to run this sort of trial. A little bit for observational trials and a lot for interventional trials. which is to say, right now the question is who has the resources to run significant clinical trials? And the answer is pharma and kind of the NIH and a couple of big foundations can put together a few once in a while, right? There's a reason that we don't have tons of publicly funded trials, because they're quite expensive. And so we get a relatively small and really distorted set of the people that can potentially run trials. Even when we're not talking about interventional trials, even when we're talking about observational trials, data mining, that kind of stuff, assembling data is really hard and really expensive. And so we have a set of kind of familiar actors who are doing this sort of knowledge generation. And those actors have inherent biases about what they're interested, the problems they're interested in solving, the answers they're looking to find, the things that they find worth doing, the methods that they use, all of those sorts of things. And I think part of the benefit of imagining this type of system is it makes the barrier to entry much lower. And lets you say, you know what, like I am a hospital system, and I would love to know which of these 2 different drugs works better for my patient because I'm just interested in treating patients better, or because down the road I suspect that the costs of those drugs may be different and I want to be able to have better negotiating leverage, and I can just run a clinical trial within the context of the care that I'm already providing in a way that previously I would have been resource constrained out of doing. So I think that one possibility is this actually ends up being pretty democratizing in terms of the process of enabling lots more research. Generic substitution and blinding and, drug something.
Drug advertising.
Drug advertising, thank you. Drug advertising. Yeah, I think these are all instances where you say, yeah, sometime like we've got some messiness around the edges, and I can't say this is going to be perfect and iron out all the wrinkles, but I think it's going to be substantially better. Which is to say, if you got a patient that comes in and says, I want no-no-pain, and I'm not going to consent to be treated with Decapitol because no-no-pain is the drug for me, like, give them no-no-pain. They're not part of the study. Your study's now a little bit less unbiased than it was before, and that's a bummer. Your data sample's a little bit smaller, and that's a bummer, but that's not to say that you don't have a still an ongoing study that you didn't have before. And then, the last point on the ethics of who gets new drugs, if we start to know that something's really happening differently, is really interesting. When do you say, you know what? Turns out no-no-pain is the drug for women over 40, and I'm not going to waste any time giving them Decapitol at all. Everybody gets no-no-pain. How much information do you need to know to say that? Is a really interesting question, right? It's the same sort of question as when you're running a clinical trial in general, and like I don't remember, what was the blinded clinical trial, or the clinical trial that they cut off like a couple weeks in because they're like, whoa, this is so much better than the old standard of care that we cannot ethically continue this trial because everybody on the placebo, we have to switch them over to the new standard immediately. I don't remember what that was. Anyway, that happens. And so I think you could imagine that happening here. If you have strong, unmistakable signals that are like, yeah, this works, this is the one for these people, then you switch it over, and then you switch over to an observational system, right? You stop the randomization, but you keep watching them. And you say, okay, we're now going to give all of these people, this whole set, women over 40, they all get no-no-pain, and then we watch. And if they keep coming back for complaints of migraines, then you say, oh, okay, that was an initial signal, but it was a blip. And now we'll restart something interventional, or restart randomization, and see where we go from here.
Good question here.
George, are you still interested in asking a question?
I will ask very quickly because you've got a lot of hands over on this side.
All right.
So this is really a question about the informed consent. I mean, so as you may know, I am generally pretty skeptical of informed consent as a general proposition, even in the best of cases. Here, I am really failing to see, a big consent problem. And I'm wondering, like in your view, is the consent, if this were just observational, right? We already do tons of observationals, and just sort of informal doctors' user experience and share information around the hospital and whatnot based on treatment. There's no additional consent required for that. Pharmacovigilance, right? We do this, this is required. Companies do it, hospitals do it. We report to the FDA, and we figure out what side effects are, right? So there's no extra consent required for that. Is it simply, is the difference here the switch that you might alter somebody's treatment regimen because the research is happening, you're going to put 70% of the people on drug A rather than drug B? Is that it? And if so, that seems like a really small and non-risky step that I would think everyone should just do what Vanderbilt does without worrying about it at all. But
So, is your question, what's the right thing to do, or how do people worried about informed consent think about it now?
well, people who are worried about informed consent probably, well, I can imagine why they worry about it. But I think they worry too much.
Yeah, look, we're on the same page. I agree. I think worrying about informed consent in this situation is very silly. It's deeply silly, especially if we're talking about randomization within the standard of care
Right.
or observational data that's just going to improve care for you and other people. I find that sort of worry very silly. I'm not worried about it. That said, there are a bunch of people that are really stressed out about informed consent. IRBs are a big set of it. We'll set aside the issues with IRBs because that's a lot. I think if you want to say informed consent is an important part of the medical system because it's based in lots of treaties and declarations, and it's a really important way that we safeguard autonomy, which a lot of people say, then a way to consider dealing with that is to say we get informed consent for the context of care. This provides no additional danger over the context of care. Sure, the role of doctor versus researcher is a little bit different, but here really we're starting to blend them more, and overall we're going to be improving care, not even for other people, but also for you, and so we think that informed consent can do double duty. Let's all not worry about this and go home. That's how I picture this. If you could say, like, this isn't a big deal, let's just stop stressing about it, I would be pretty happy with that. But I'm not convinced that that's going to go over generally.
So you've got a bunch of questions.
Yes. Yes.
So my question is kind of, when I think of quality of care, I kind of think of it as like encompassing several different factors.
Mhm.
And so this seems to only be recognizing like the speed and effectiveness of drugs that are prescribed. But I think that randomizing could reduce quality of care in other areas when it comes to like communication between doctors and their patients, or like that relationship, bedside manner, different things like that that go into, that are factored into quality of care. So what's kind of your perspective on that? If patients aren't talking to their doctors about these are the options, these are kind of side effects, what side effects do you think you could live with if you take this drug and it gives you these side effects, and kind of that whole process?
Yeah, that's a really great point. I don't mean to lie that all the other points that were made weren't great. Sorry, let's just presume every point made before or after this was also a great point. And please forgive me if I forget to say it, which I will undoubtedly do all the rest of the times. All right, so yes, totally right. Interesting implications for how this can affect the doctor-patient relationship, right? So one question is, if doctors are thinking about their patients as not just patients, but also being involved in the process of research, does that mean that we treat them, or does that mean that the doctor-patient treat the patients differently? And does the process of having an EHR say, here's the drug for you, does that decrease the communication between doctors and patients? So as to the second point, which I think is more the pointed bit of this, I think if we have enough information to say nonopain and decapital, they work, each one of them works about 30% of the time. Nonopain tends to cause nausea, decapital tends to cause sleeplessness. Then I think this probably isn't a suitable candidate for this sort of trial, unless we have some other reason to believe that patients, that some set of patients don't care about that. But I think we say no. These really aren't interchangeable drugs. These are drugs where here are distinct and meaningful differences, and those we're going to have to decide in the context of the doctor-patient relationship and say what's important to you, how do you balance the risks and or the costs and benefits of this particular treatment, and we'll make a choice that's best for you. And hopefully, over time, then this falls into I think of the observational trials as kind of the backstop here. We'll do randomized things when we can to try to do more causation, but otherwise, we'll just keep collecting the data and analyzing it. And if the answer is, as we look at the data, anecdotally, we thought it worked about 30% of the time, but really, turns out nonopain works about 50% of the time in this subgroup, and about 20% of the time in this other subgroup, then we say, okay, now it's not just an issue about side effects, now we really have different knowledge about these drugs, and so the whole calculus has shifted. I'm very happy with that. I think interventional trials are great when those kind of electronic interventional randomized trials are great when that specific set of circumstances shows up and we really care about causation. But I'm really happy to do a lot of observational work that we're just not doing now, if that doesn't work out.
Okay, so just one follow-up to that.
Sure.
Where drugs have like lists of side effects that are like pages long, do you
Yes.
think there will still be enough drugs to really make it meaningful to do randomized trials when so many different drugs have so many different side effects, and those can change throughout the trials too as they see things?
Yeah, there's a question as to where you set the line for saying this is a meaningful thing, right? So drugs have long lists of side effects. If you look at those lists of side effects, there's tremendous overlap between lots of different drugs in the same class. Lots of them are very, very rare. And so part of the detail of hashing this out is to say how much similarity is enough to say, you know what, these drugs are essentially the same. They're essentially interchangeable. And I think part of that is going to be, we can think about grounding that to some extent in the standard of care now, which is to say, if looking at these drugs now, we can say, doctors say like, here's the way to choose between these drugs. This drug has this set of side effects that's important, and this drug has this other set of side effects that's important. Then we'd say, okay, it's not a candidate for doing this sort of clinical trial. If on the other hand, there's that, you know, here's this drug, it works for some people, we're going to try it on you, and if it doesn't work, we'll switch to this other drug. That sounds like a great example of something where switching into an ad hoc, or sorry, into an ex-ante randomization system makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Yes.
So this is a few points back and kind of just a baseline question about
Sure.
learning health systems to kind of help me conceptualize what this is looking like. So can a learning health system be like any kind of provider, like a provider, a hospital system, a department, and then sort of what does that mean when you talk about different kinds of electronic medical record systems as far as sort of making all of this work and talk and...
Yeah, you can imagine this scale. So the idea of a learning health system is a pretty simple one, and it's pretty scalable. It's just the idea that there's essentially a cyclic process of care, generates data, generates knowledge, improves care, which then generates more data and yada yada. And the point is that, so right now, we basically think about care, and then it kind of doesn't do much. If it does do something, then sometimes people, like a subset of care will generate data, and then that essentially just goes out into papers. And we imagine, maybe, that somebody takes these papers and occasionally reads them and improves care, and that sometimes happens. But it turns out it's like a 17-year lag before a new innovation makes its way into clinical care. This is not at all systematized and routinized. And so the basic concept's pretty simple, which is just that we take this data and we generate knowledge and we put it back into care, and that's going to be happening routinely all the time. That can happen in the context of a couple providers in an office. Like, oh, hey, we do this thing and it keeps not working. We should record the fact that we do this thing. Now that we've started noticing what we do, it turns out it keeps not working. Let's not do that thing anymore. All the way up to saying, you know, Intermountain Health or Kaiser Permanente, or one of the big integrated payers saying, we have data on, you know, 100,000 different patients, and it turns out, as Kaiser Permanente found, that patients that are taking these new painkillers have lots more heart attacks than patients that were taking these old painkillers, and maybe Vioxx shouldn't be a drug that we sell anymore, right? That's an early example of this sort of data collection and learning healthcare system. You can imagine at lots of different levels. Yes?
Yeah, so I was just wondering if the division between the clinical care and research, is that more just a problem here in the United States, or is that because of the regulations, or is that, how does that work on like an international level?
It's pretty common.
Yeah.
It seems, I'm not a comparative medical scholar. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong about this. My basic belief is that this is a problem lots and lots of places, even places that you'd think would be better about integrating it because they have a less fragmented healthcare system, like the NHS in the UK. The Helsinki Accords, like, hey, research, you got to be really careful about this stuff, and they're pretty powerful, and the Nuremberg trials were a big deal, and so people are careful about research. And part of the ways to be careful about research is to say, this is over here in a special box, and we are very, very careful about this. And I think that ethos has permeated the medical system in lots of different contexts. Was that a question, or are you pointing to something that I haven't done yet?
I actually want to intervene.
Yes.
To just ask you to distinguish the interventional stuff from the informational.
Okay.
Because I think it plays out differently in these contexts. And actually, the revisions to the common rule would, if they ever happen, will do that. So, now I don't know what people, whether other IRBs are like this, but a lot of places now, if what you're doing is informational only, and you appropriately guarantee confidentiality, the IRB review is basically just making sure that because you can get HIPAA waivers, saying the research would not be practicable without the waiver, because it's, you can't go back and 10 years back,
Right.
identify all the people you've treated with arthritis or whatever it is, migraine. So that's treated really differently than the randomization ones.
Yeah, so
And so,
Yeah.
we've got the mechanism pretty much in place for the learning informational stuff. What we don't have is the randomization.
So I will definitely agree with you on the I will definitely agree that the infrastructure is not there for the randomization.
Yeah.
I am thrilled that here the IRBs are better about that. I do not think that is a universal trend.
It varies with institution.
Yeah, some institutions are great about it, and IRBs can grant HIPAA waivers, and they can make informed consent less problematic, obviously, especially if you're using so you can do this, but it varies pretty significantly jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and by jurisdiction I mean institution that's hosting the IRB, which itself creates its own it's an interesting issue, right? When we have this variation in IRBs, is that more like laboratories of democracy, where we say here are lots of different places that do research in different ways and we see which models work best? Or is it more like fragmented patchwork of systems that makes it really hard to aggregate data on a big scale and run this stuff in systematically controllable ways across different jurisdictions? And I'm not 100% convinced that both of those aren't true, or which one of them is dominant. But you're quite right. Some places, this is not, the observational stuff is not nearly as much of an issue. Although, I would also point out that the common rule revision, or the common rule revisions include a provision that says we're not gonna treat anonymous data as human subjects, but we're gonna revisit what counts as anonymous data, and we might change the rules. And so to the extent that we think we're gathering more data and making it easier to re-identify data and gather more information about this, that could change quite a bit with not a lot of administrative friction. Yeah, yes.
So how do you think the system would affect the economics of just research and development? You mentioned there's going to be winners and losers between drugs. No pain and Decapital loses in your lecture, but so that could increase costs of research and development. But do you think maybe just the efficiency of having a system like this in place could reduce costs?
So I think we would expect this system to reduce costs overall. Whether it's going to reduce aggregate costs is a difficult dynamic question, because we presumably be doing a bunch more research, but it should be relatively low friction research. Ideally, it should result in improving care. If it results in improving care by things that are more efficient, we'd expect to see costs lower. If it ends up saying, actually, all these new drugs that have come out that have high list prices are more effective, or if it just says drugs that we thought were equivalent and therefore we had competition between a couple drugs in the same class, it says, actually, that one over there is really the winner, then we'd expect them to jack their price up. So it's hard to know, I think, what the overall impacts on costs would be, just because our system is so screwy that knowing the overall impact of almost anything on costs is hard to predict. I think we'd have to say we hope it will improve quality. We think it might increase efficiency and might reduce costs, but there's a big star next to that might, because because it depends on how things play out and the relative power of people in the system and how we react to a bunch of stuff down the road. Yeah.
So I want to stress out about informed consent a little bit.
Okay.
Is that cool? Okay, so I really have two totally competing thoughts. So one is that I don't know that informed consent is really ever that informed, right? Because what are these people doing? Like signing a bunch of forms when they come into the hospital with a huge migraine? Like, are they reading anything? Is like the same thing as like click wrap and shrink wrap stuff, right? So on one hand, I don't know, they're never getting consent anyway. On the other hand, to the extent they're giving consent for things like being at like a teaching hospital, this is really, what you're proposing is really not that different, right? Like, here you are, you're here to get better, and also you're going to be doing something else. So I guess that they're almost like they're competing arguments, and I would just like you to sort that out for me.
That sounds like you're not stressing out about informed consent at all. It sounds like you're saying
Neutral.
informed consent isn't a big deal, so I'm not going to stress out about it.
I'm stressing out about the fact I'm not stressing out about it.
Yeah, should we
care?
There's like, okay, so there's all this like contract stuff about how like we should make like privacy notices, for instance, easier to read or like, you know, easier for consumers to understand. Like, do we care about this in the informed consent context? Or do we just like pull a fast one on the sick people and like do experiments on them? Is this being recorded?
This is recorded.
Yes, this is being recorded.
Wait, is it really?
Yes.
Awesome.
No informed consent!
I love informed consent. Autonomy is great.
Is there real autonomy? And if there's not, do we care about it? And if there's not, then do we not care about it at all at any time?
There's a joke about a joke that I like a lot, but is super duper nerdy. Is what are the 4 values of American bioethics? Autonomy, 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 and autonomy. That's not so true. It's not as true as it used to be. But I think there's a strain that says, like, by far the most, we had these fights. There's a principlist approach to bioethics that says, you have autonomy and social justice and non-maleficence and beneficence. And we look at all these 4 and we see how something plays out in these 4 things. And then realistically what ends up happening is we go with autonomy.
That's true.
That's, not so great, I think. We have justifications for saying other things besides autonomy are important. Honestly, I find pretty convincing. The argument that it's also really problematic to go into a healthcare system that we don't know what we're doing. And that if I'm not sure how often the informed consent to care, we might imagine this is a leveling up versus leveling down situation. One version is to say, well, yeah, we can just have informed consent to care, sort of double duty as also informed consent to research, and we don't worry about it. The other version of that is, holy crap, why don't we actually give people informed consent to care? Do they know how little we know about giving medical care? And maybe like that informed consent should be really intense, and your doctor should be saying, we're winging this really hard. I'm not really in favor of that either. There's a part of informed consent that I think is a ritual. And a shibboleth that says, this is how we're going to take you through it, we're going to do these signs, and that is an important part of what we think about as the research process, or potentially the process of care. I'm uncertain exactly how much value that ritual really has. I'm not a medical ethicist at all, by any stretch of the imagination, as you can probably tell, which is why I wonder sometimes why I waded into this. But I share your not being super duper concerned. Maybe that doesn't help your wording.
Just weigh in on the informed consent thing. So even if we all agree that we don't care about autonomy for the sake of autonomy, I think one situation where we might agree that informed consent would be important is if we have any fear at all that the research that's going on is somehow going to change the quality of care, right? And so that, and you're arguing that the research is just only going to make care better, but I think you could also make arguments that blurring this line between researcher and caregiver could make the quality of care worse, right? Because in just to kind of say generally, you know, if the person is so concerned about like getting results for their study, right? Maybe they're less focused on what is actually, you know, individually best for this patient, right? And so I think in those situations, then, yeah, maybe you do want the patient to really know, like, this is something that we're doing, and this could actually affect, you know, the quality of care that you're getting, and we really want you to, you know, sign off on this in a meaningful way.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The question, I think, can boil down to how much do we think the two hats problem really matters, and how much we think the two hats problem being the doctor as both provider of care and a researcher, and they're serving two different roles there. One of them is, you know, really just about the patient. One of them is about the patient, but not really, and it's mostly about generalizable knowledge. This is a point that you raised earlier. You know, to what extent does this actually shift the quality of care that you're getting? I think part of the answer to this is actually, I've been described as a techno-utopian, which I like.
Good name for a band.
Thank you. To be fair, I've been described by that as that by me. And so actually, I think the technology helps to solve this to some extent, to the extent that we can really not bury this, but make it really frictionless in the context of an EHR that people are using anyway. Then electronic health records. Then I think part of that issue goes away, right? Because doctors are already used to saying, here, I'm gonna put this information, I'm gonna type in my diagnosis, and it comes up with a list of drugs to use. And actually, you know, if you're not just comparing 2 drugs, if you're comparing like 4 drugs, you can still do useful comparisons if just every patient, instead of getting a list of all 4 drugs, get the list of 3 drugs, and you can still do like cool randomization with that, you can still back out the numbers. So you can have an even more seamless experience where it's not just like, here's the drug for you, it's here are 3 drugs for you. You can still pick, you can still do randomization, and it looks very, very similar to what happens now. So to the extent that this is an underlying kind of seamless part of the health experience, I think the mental part of the two-hat problem can kind of go away, at least ideally. George.
Okay, I just wanted to follow back up on the comparative question, right?
Yeah.
That I forget
Okay.
who even asked it, but you know, because it ties into this idea, right? So this intense autonomy focus is an American thing, right? I mean, this is, you know, in the same line of don't vaccinate my kids, don't take my guns. You know, it's like an individualistic.
I'm not speaking to that one, no.
I want the recording to pick this up. There are a lot of guns here.
And children.
And children, yeah. So, right, so this autonomy thing is sort of flows throughout a lot of intellectual discourse in this country. It is not necessarily the same in Europe, right? So I'm collaborating with a Danish researcher right now on a project, Francisca Nordfalk, who was here for the week. Anyway, I mean, it turns out in Scandinavia, in Estonia, and in Iceland, all of these places with national biobanks, research is just allowed. It's just there isn't this note. It's a very communitarian approach as opposed.
Right.
And that's largely data research. Research using data.
Yes,
That's true in
using
France, too.
using samples, biobank samples
Exactly.
that people have given. But the philosophy is a communitarian one, right? It's sort of a social good communitarian. And, they balanced the risks to individuals versus the bench society, and they came out this way. And you just don't hear, the strong, individualistic strain of argument there you do here. So I think, Nuremberg was a long time ago, and I think that even though in Europe it's not, we sort of fear it more here than in Europe.
If the answer is just that we're way behind everybody else and we're going to catch up, then I'm thrilled by that answer. I will say, mostly because I thought this was funny, I was presenting this project in September, and and somebody said, well, why do we treat research subjects so much more carefully than we treat clinical patients? And I said, it's going to sound weird to say this, but I think the answer is Nazis. And I meant for that to be a laugh line, because it sounds ridiculous, but it turns out that right now, I mean, it's also true, but it turns out that now, that was not as funny as I had initially thought that it might be, and so that didn't work very well. Sort of was also not as funny as I thought it might be.
So I actually have a short comment that reconciles some of these points about informed consent. So you will get pushback because there are some crazy informed consent people. I am not one of those people, but I do really take seriously the underlying justification for informed consent, which just doesn't happen to be at play as much here. So the concern is obviously exploitation.
Right.
You go into a hospital and they do a bunch of pap smears on you while you're under anesthesia, and you've ostensibly given some blanket consent to that, and they do that. But that's the concern, is the dignitary exploitation, and if you're setting out that there's equipoise between these two things, or relative equipoise, you just don't have the same concern about exploitation. So take seriously the informed consent. It's not silly, it's incredibly important, but it's just the underlying justifications for it aren't at play here, because you're not diminishing someone's autonomy when you're, and maybe this has to do with if a system is exploiting the people, but the issue is relatively equal information. We don't have the same concerns as like an individual who might be peddling a certain drug because they have a conflict of interest or something like that.
That goes back to Richard's original question, which is, how do you look at the overall issue about the clinical trial design, right? So, I mean, you haven't said anything about what kind of oversight there might be about how we decide that what the system is doing is okay with respect to the side effect issue, that we don't have the drug companies in some way or another coming in and paying the system to skew who gets the drug or whatever it might be. But we're assuming that we really have the equivalent of equipoise here.
Yeah,
And how do you, so
that's a big assumption.
Yeah.
Quite right.
Yeah.
So I don't mean to imply that I never think informed consent is important. Consent is important, informed consent is also important. I think that in this particular context, these are issues where you're quite right that the issues that make us concerned about informed consent tend not to show up as much, particularly if we're saying our limits here are essentially to retrospective observational data and identifying patterns in them, and to running randomized trials that are nonetheless within the standard of care and by hypothesis.
Right, so that's good. Just real quick, I was at a talk where Carl Schneider talked about informed consent with IRBs and how it's a First Amendment problem, and he got booed. Okay, like people were hissing. People don't do that at academic conferences. They were hissing him, and so I think there will be. It's just careful in the language, because there will be people. There will be people who are just going to read into it things that you don't need. So.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Wait, I haven't heard from you yet, and I haven't heard from you yet. I don't think. So we'll go with you, and then you, and then you.
Okay.
Yeah, it's you.
I was actually talking to you.
Oh, me? No, I'm
Yeah.
okay.
I'm
enjoying
All right, go back to you, and then I'm sorry I don't know any of your names, except a few people.
So my comment also has to do with informed consent again,
Yes.
but I think that kind of changing the way we think about informed consent in this context to make it more of a happy medium between how research informed consent already happens and healthcare research, or just clinical care informed consent happens, could actually kind of fix some of the problems that I was seeing with the quality of care issues, with the relationship between the doctor and patient.
Mm-hmm.
If the doctors are like providing more information about this is how we're going to be giving you drugs and this, because I think if they explained it to these patients, then there wouldn't be that disconnect anymore, and they would buy into this idea of blurring the lines between clinical care and research more.
Yeah, so we can imagine a model that's more just upfront with patients about this is what medical care looks like, and it turns out we're in a learning healthcare system, but we're pretty early in the learning process. We don't know that much. Here's what we know, and we're going to try to keep learning through the process, and we want you to help us with that. I think that model of like, this is what it's like to be a patient in today's medical system is a much better and much truer understanding of care and research than what we do now.
Right.
So totally agree.
Okay.
Yes.
so forgive me for being a cynic, and you can tell me I'm being too much of a Debbie Downer. But in thinking about the incentives that the various actors here
Yes.
have, and thinking about what that means for informed consent, I think most people like to think of the idea that informed consent is about you giving permission to participate in a process where the objective is improving the quality of your healthcare. Whereas, or healthcare in general, I'll even go to that. But I wonder what the C-suite is thinking about all this, and I'm thinking about the executives at a large care center where isn't there incentive to participate, to implement this, that as reimbursement, especially government reimbursement, moves away from fee-for-service to bundled, they care about this, the CFO cares about this because they want to maximize, right, their return on whatever their reimbursement is. Am I too worried that there's a conflict between the care that you give people to maximize reimbursement for Intermountain Healthcare or the U and the decisions you're gonna make on care if it's actually about care? And then just one last thing is, what does that mean for attention with the quality of research, right? Because, and I've never worked in a large healthcare system, so you might be like, this is not a problem. But why would the CEO of Intermountain ever authorize their bioinformatics department to share information with the U or to merge data sets to figure out what a drug is? Because doesn't Intermountain, which is the big competitor to the U here, right? So those are the two big medical centers here. Don't they want to have a competitive edge from this research they're doing rather than merging it to get the big end?
Yeah, so really fascinating, interesting issues. If you agree that this is fascinating, interesting issues, Becky Eisenberg and I wrote a paper specifically on innovation by health insurers and why we don't see more of it and what's up with here. But you know, good to see you. It's a really naughty, interesting question. I'll say a couple of things. One of them is
Naughty and interesting, not interesting.
Correct. Naughty.
Or naughty.
Or naughty.
Right. Naughty with a K.
Naughty.
Tangled.
I'm worried people might be
and
naughty, right?
interesting.
Right. Yes, you're worried about people. Yeah, excellent. So it's both of those things. I will agree with you that we can think of these people as having their own distinct incentives, which are not necessarily pure as the driven snow, even though there is in fact lots of driven snow here in Intermountain and the U, I guess. One interesting response to that is, of course, we have other actors in the system that have distinctly different incentives, and to the extent that this ends up being democratizing, we'd expect to see increases in research and knowledge created by actors with different incentives, which is better than what we have now. To the extent that I think what we have now is the systemic data, especially about drugs, tends to come from actors with one particular set of incentives, which is to say, to sell new expensive drugs. We might imagine that we'd also want to see research demonstrating that old cheaper drugs are better than new expensive drugs, or at least not worse. For less money. And we'd expect to see that, say, Intermountain or the U have incentives to do exactly that type of research. We might expect that we might have some truly disinterested parties, like academics or, I don't know really that disinterested. We might have academics or government with their own different incentives. And to the extent that we that we lower barriers to running this sort of thing, whether it's observational or interventional, we'd see different flawed parties with different flawed incentives coming up with studies aimed in different directions. And we might expect in the kind of American marketplace of ideas and litigation and all of that kind of conflict-driven arriving at the truth, we might see better results eventually. That's the hope. We can also imagine that some of these parties are less driven by incentives than we might cynically think, but that's ultimately a difficult to evaluate empirical question. As to why people would share data, or why people wouldn't share data, there are a lot of places, I mean, competition in healthcare is really crappy. and often it happens in a lot of mechanisms other than competing on care. Frankly, if the answer to this was Intermountain versus the U ended up trying to run lots of observational studies because they wanted to be able to say, look, we give you much better care because we are great at learning from our data and improving our processes, I would count that as a total win. Like, that would be awesome. Right now, I think they tend to compete on lots of other things. And so I'm not sure that that's going to be the edge that actually is going to drive a lot of this. Overall, I'm in favor of taking these systems and making them really big. Like, I'm all about really big observational data sets so we can do all sorts of cool things. So I'm a huge fan of the precision health initiatives, all of us cohort, where we're saying let's take 1 million Americans and collect tons of data on them and make it available for all sorts of cool research, except I want it to be like 50 million or 100 million. And I think that'd be great. Like, I'm all about that. So the data as infrastructure issue is, yes, it's key, and if we end up being little silos, that's gonna be problematic, but you know, even if we have little silos, as I said, that are one health system at a time, that's just trying to eke out what sort of cool improvement they can and market it, that's better than what we got now. I'll take it.
There might be benefits to sharing also.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
the other thing, of course, is
That outweigh the cost.
right, that
The fear.
if the U sees, 5 patients with pancreatic cancer a year, and Intermountain sees, or if they each see 500 patients a year, and it turns out you need 1,000 to get useful information out of it, both of them might have, like, sharing is gonna be a useful situation, and if they both get the benefits, and if they can both reduce their costs, then the competitive thing's gonna wash out, and it'll just be both of them saving some money, and that's good, or improving care, and that's also good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great way to end, and the food will be